busy in the last few minutes offering and trying to offer you hospitality that we've neglected to watch the time. So we're a little late in starting. Can I ask if you can all hear me? Right. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Vincent Strudwick, an old friend of mine, where he's had a very long and distinguished career, including a Lambeth doctorate. He's a theologian and a historian, and he's very well up on Benedictine spirituality, so we couldn't be ending this series with a finer person. And I think I'll just hand it over to you, Vincent. Yeah. Welcome.
Georgie, thank you for your welcome. Rooted and grounded in love, Benedict's legacy for us today. I've come unhooked. Sorry, the specs weren't. This is an enclosed order of nuns. No one goes in or comes out. Dora was stunned by this information. She stopped. "Do you mean," she said, "that they are completely imprisoned in there?" Mrs. Mark laughed. "Not imprisoned, my dear," she said. "They are there of their own free will. This is not a prison. It is, on the contrary, a place that is very hard to get into, and only the strongest achieve it. Like Mary in the parable, they have chosen the better part." They walked on. "Don't they ever come out?" asked Dora. "No," said Mrs. Mark. "Being Benedictines, they take a vow of stability. That is, they remain all their lives in the house where they take their first vows. They die and are buried in the nuns' cemetery." "How absolutely appalling," said Dora. Iris Murdoch's novel, The Bell. You probably recognized it. And in this novel, Dora echoes the often unspoken fear of an increasingly restless and now Twitter-fueled generation, confronted by a life rooted in stability. Yet Dora's fearful reaction is also met by a certain fascination among many to explore what seems so alien to their experience. It's a both and. It may be useful to recall that the beginnings of Benedictine spirituality go back to the fall of the Roman Empire. Society under Rome had been ordered, and the Pax Romana reached right round the Mediterranean. Roman law, Greek language, together with an amazing communication system that had been fundamental to the spread of Christianity, had held together a huge mixture of peoples. However, as the empire declined and broke up, things changed. The economy was in tatters, law broke down, and there were vast movements of peoples no longer clear about their identity, rootless and savage. It was in this restless society that, following some time as a hermit, Benedict came to Monte Cassino, where he found his community of monks, remaining there until his death in 537. This then is the context in which we read the beginning of the rule, where we're given a picture of the Lord in the marketplace, calling out to passers-by with an offer to get the most out of life. Who is the man who desires life and would see good days? The call is to live, not just to survive. And in the stable environment of the monastery, Benedict offered a school for the Lord's service, where the freedom sought in chaos might really be found. Freedom instability, in what Dora perceived as prison. It must be nearly 20 years now since I was asked to give a retreat for an Anglican Benedictine monastery. And I wrote with a question to Dame Felicitas Corrigan, Benedictine nun of Stanbrook Abbey, beginning a correspondence which went on for some time, usually conducted half in English and half in Latin. She was more familiar with the latter. And my question was, what is at the root of the Benedictine tradition? I wanted to get it clear before I worked on this retreat. What is the essence? Now, I knew from my own experience, from the Abbey of Beck, from Downside, from Worth, St. Benet's, various Anglican Benedictine houses of both men and women, that there are many ways of being Benedictine. I knew that. But Dame Felicity went to the essence, and she replied in this text. She said she'd taken my letter to another sister, read out my question, and they had both responded together that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that we, being rooted and grounded in love, may able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ which passeth knowledge, that we might be filled with the fullness of God. Ephesians 3. Now, I had that letter and those that followed, and a greatly treasured one, I have to say. I read them from time to time. In the framework of the Benedictine pattern of life, with the psalmody of the choir office providing words for a daily dialogue with God, done in company with all the saints in one, whose daily life is regulated by the rule that all may know their place in a corporate life based on agape. This is the rooting and grounding in love for which the word stability stands. In her introduction to the edition of the rule published in 1990, Esther Duval, who spoke earlier in this series, wrote, "His rule is all about love. It is a practical guide to help men and women establish and maintain loving relationships with God, with others, with the material world, and also, perhaps surprisingly to those who associate Christianity, and particularly monasticism, with denial and asceticism, with one's own self. It is the whole person that is addressed in the Rule of St. Benedict, the whole God-given human being made up of body, mind, and spirit. In this School for the Lord's Service, there is a realism about how people are, how we are, how relationships break down, because we're all so different. Benedict knew that. I'm reminded of the special post office parcel unit which deals with parcels that come unwrapped. It featured in the newspapers some Christmases ago. And among their finds was a stuffed snake, a parcel of lion droppings, an angel with a halo that lit up. I like to think that if ever those parcels arrived, that the person who received them would have said, just what I wanted. We're all different. And there are many ways of going wrong. And Benedict was aware of this. And the community's grounding in love provided correction, and there's quite a list of expected faults, and an expectation that we are on a sort of snakes and ladders board, where there's a great deal of ascending and descending, but the stability of the community and the grace and love of God flowing through it enables the monk's journey. It is indeed this emphasis on being rooted and grounded in love that lies at the heart of Benedict's legacy for us. And no generation needs to be alerted to this more than our own Facebook and Twitter users, perhaps the medium through which we should repeat Benedict's marketplace call for today, as I believe one Benedict house in London actually does. It's an extraordinary paradox to me that the communication revolution, with its wonderful potential, is in danger of both being a vehicle of sharing ignorance and also of trivializing relationships. You'll be cross with me later on about that. In his book, The Christ-like God, Anglican Bishop John Taylor wrote, before the E-revolution had really got underway, it is the almost universal loss of the sense of being in relationship with the otherness of other persons and of being answerable to them as part of one body, the almost total loss of the word community, which renders our present society and nation so inimical to the sense of God and so incapable of prayer. And now, 30 years after he wrote that, if ever a legacy was relevant to our situation, I think this surely is. Benedictine houses, of course, are conscious of this. Through the ministry of hospitality, many people are brought into the rhythm of Benedict's call to life. You've listened to Michael Woodward on lay monks. I wish I'd heard what he said. And at the beginning of the course, you heard Don Stephen Ortinger, Worth. 40 years ago, I was captivated by the experiments with the lay community, as it then was, of Worth, when we lived nearby, and I got to know Don Christopher Jameson. Some of you may have seen the TV programs when he was abbot there, offering hospitality to a variety of people, so they could have a taste of the Benedictine experience and see where it led. And more people are aware that the resource is there and is thoughtfully developed in a rich variety of ways. But just a word for a moment about my own Anglican tradition and the way in which the divine office, at the heart of the Benedictine life, set out for the first time in one volume at Monte Cassino in 1099, was preserved in post-Reformation England through to the spread of the Anglican Communion, numbering 77 million today. Christopher Dawson, who was a historian, also a Catholic, writing in the 1930s, he taught my own tutor, George Every, wrote that the Benedictine order was the cornerstone not only of the Carolingian Empire, but of the social order of Christendom of the Middle Ages. Its educational and liturgical influence was at the heart of that period of history. And although the changes in the 16th century brought both a break with the authority of Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries, through the work of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the Benedictine liturgical influence continued to inform both the spirituality of the Anglican clergy as well as the worship of the laity in the new dispensation. This new dispensation had both the Bible in English and from 1549 a Book of Common Prayer, and both these provided a context in which queen and poet, housewife and yeoman lived and died. And at the heart of the Book of Common Prayer was Cranmer's work as a liturgist, following the pioneering work of Cardinal Quignon. In the office, many accretions of prayers and readings were removed from the Latin version, but from the Deus in Adjutorium through the regular recitation of the Psalter, completed in a monthly cycle, Bible readings and prayers, through a liturgical year carefully set out in the calendar, a breviary for the clergy, and regular public worship for the people was put in place. There were some early revisions, but from the Feast of St. John the Baptist in 1559, the Elizabethans established a pattern of devotion with breaks in the day so that one could recall God and his presence, that was resumed and renewed in the revision of 1662. The provision of the Eucharist was, of course, the main feature of the book, but morning and evening prayer, based on Matins and Lauds and Vespers and Compline, is the main focus that I wish to turn to today. It was ordered in this Elizabethan prayer book that all priests and deacons shall be bound to say daily the morning and evening prayer, either privately or openly, except they be netted by preaching, the study of divinity, or some other urgent cause. Privately, they may say the same in any language they themselves understand. I like that. You could go on saying it in Latin if you wanted. And of course, in the university here, the term Eucharist in Latin continued to the present day. Something I used to enjoy doing until I retired. The laity were increasingly made familiar with this pattern in the parish churches on Sundays, and when the parson rang the bell, as he was commanded to, through the week. I remember mainly being an academic through my ministry, but when I was, for a short time, parish priest of a parish in Suffolk, in Sussex, I used to get up and say Matins as ordered by the canons, and ring the bell, and then say Matins and go down to collect my paper from the nice but godless lady at the paper shop. And but I remember one particular morning I overslept. I didn't ring the bell, I didn't say Matins, but I toddled down to the paper shop where she looked at me sternly and said, "Overslept this morning, did you? No bell, no prayers." And I thought you were going to say, "So no paper," but she didn't. Interesting, you see, this call in different ways to pause, as the little hours instruct us to. A different pattern, but one that was very much, I think, was very much influenced by the Benedictine tradition. And Cranmer was responsible for this. In the cathedrals and other great churches, the daily round of prayer was often celebrated with new music. This in contrast to the Protestantism on the continent, where music was often associated with the devil. Here, Tallis and Byrd, while perhaps composing their finest music for the Latin Rite, wrote the most beautiful motets for the Queen, biblical, based on the Psalms and in English. Many, of course, were laments for the Catholicism of the past. By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept. Those in the know knew what they were mourning. But this was for the Queen and has been a lasting part of the Anglican tradition of music. The nearest, I should also say, yes, I have in my possession, my father gave it to me, a book published in 1688, and it's excerpts from the Book of Common Prayer for the laity and the family, you see. And it was a prayer book, it says, as well for the temple as the closet, which meant that it was to be used at home and as part of a family tradition. And excerpts from Matins and Evensong were broken up anew so that at midday you could pause to reflect God and have prayers before you dined and so on. It is the most interesting book. And I gather there were many of these books published through the 17th century as the family began to adopt a sort of rhythm. It's the rhythm of recall to God that the Benedictine tradition holds for us. The nearest we Anglicans have to a theological founding father, I think, is Richard Hooker of Corpus, and later Master of the Temple, who stoutly defended the Anglican musical pattern of devotion based on psalmody against the many Puritan opponents. He says, the prophet David, having singular knowledge, not in poetry alone, but in music also, judged them both to be necessary for the house of God, and left behind him for that purpose a number of divinely inspired poems for the raising up of men's hearts and the sweetening of their affections toward God, in which consideration the Church of Christ doth likewise retain it as an ornament of God's service and a help to our own devotion. This legacy, of course, was built upon in the 19th century, when under the influence of the Oxford movement, the religious life was once again restored in the Anglican tradition. Now, some houses of sisters adopted a Roman pattern of worship, as did Nashdom Abbey, until well into the second half of the 20th century. It was said then that if they submitted to the authority of Rome at any time, the only change they would need to make in their life was the name of the bishop in the prayers for the Eucharist. Otherwise, it would be a complete swap. Others adopted an Anglican approach, using the daily hours of the Church of England, composed in English by Dr. Liddon, the Vice Principal of the Theological College at Cuddesdon. Many more Anglican congregations adopt a mixed lifestyle with a choir office and an apostolic ministry. This caused problems. The sisters who accompanied Florence Nightingale to Scutari, who earned the nickname the Handless Angels, when after some frightful skirmish they insisted on completing sext before getting on with the banjety. This tension between a full choir office through the day and an active ministry was one that Anglican communities, I think in particular, found attention. But that's what they did. In the mid-60s, I gave a paper on the renewal of the religious life in Anglicanism at a downside symposium, when perhaps the renewal was in Anglicanism was at its height, and before the dwindling of numbers of European religious that followed. It was small then in Anglicanism. Then there were about 300 men religious and about 3,000 women, roughly that. Tiny numbers compared with those in Roman Catholic houses, but nevertheless playing a significant role in the spiritual, educational and pastoral life of the Church of England and the Anglican Communion. At that time, they were punching above their weight. So the point I've been making there is that the legacy of Benedict translated not only into the Church of England, but into the culture of the nation. It's been there, it's been held, as well as by the Catholic Church and the Benedictine houses that happily were renewed and came back as time went on. Thinking now of what is called European exceptionalism, where the number of religious houses in the Northern Hemisphere, both Catholic and Anglican, is dwindling, I return to what I regard as the main legacy of Benedictine wisdom for us today, that we shall be rooted and grounded in love. Recent research over the past 20 years by Jean Twenge of San Diego State University has identified what she calls the me generation. According to her findings, the attitudes of student-age youngsters in the 1980s and 1990s contrast sharply with those of baby boomers and Generation X, their immediate predecessors at the same age. Whereas the latter were community-minded, idealistic, concerned with others and the future of the planet, the me generation focuses more and more on money, image, and fame. This is the Facebook, Twitter, and mobile phone generation of the internet age. Now, I want to avoid, I'm going to find this hard, I want to avoid what I'm about to say sounding like a rant in the oldie, although I do read that magazine from time to time. The technical and IT revolution should be a blessing. But it needs care. If I can remember this story accurately enough, but there's a story about a couple who were planning a holiday, I think in Florida, United States country. They booked their hotel, they got to the airport, and there had been some sort of muddle up, and there was only one ticket on the plane. So it was decided that the wife would go ahead, and the husband would remain behind, no, was it the other way round? No, it was the other way round. The husband went ahead and the wife remained and was going to follow him later. The husband arrived, booked into the hotel, and decided all the technical stuff was there. He could send an email to his wife. He sent the email, but he made one mistake in the address, and it was sent to a lady of that address that the one mistake had made, who had recently been bereaved, and she was sitting sort of receiving emails respecting her loss. And then she opened one up which read, "My dear wife, you'll be glad to know that I've arrived." The journey was quite difficult, but I had a wonderful reception here, and there's a remarkable amount that you'll be interested to learn when you arrive, and I gather that you're booked to come in a couple of days' time. It's really rather good here, a little warmer than I had thought. I look forward to seeing you, your loving husband. One little mistake, and a beautiful way of communicating is spoiled. And I think that's what I'm saying. I'm not ranting about Twitter and Facebook and so on. But it needs to be used, it seems to me, very carefully, and it isn't a replacement for that rooting and grounding in love, that being in touch with people really deeply, looking them in the eyes, knowing their faults, knowing how we, this real knowledge which is there in the context of community, based on the love of God and His grace, that is at the heart of the tradition that we are holding dear today. It seems to me that the scores of people on Facebook, LinkedIn and so on, excellent, but it does not in itself create any sort of quality relationship. And if it excludes the kind of Benedict carefully sought to nurture through the rule, it can be harmful and can contribute to what the me generation suffers from, according to this researcher, a loss of stability. And that is the true Benedictine legacy that we are concerned to preserve. 20 years ago, I was among the first of fellows of a new Oxford college, Kellogg. For 10 of them, I was chamberlain, a role created on the back of being master of the common, to create a fellowship of learning among teachers and students alike, and to create a sense of identity and of belonging. I don't think any other Oxford college has got a chamberlain, but that was the role in a secular college. At that time, I was also occasionally asked by Dom Henry Wansborough to give tutorials in my subject to students at St. Benet's. By now, including fewer monastics and more lay undergraduates. That was part of that change at that time. And from time to time, he would invite me as a treat to come to Latin Vespers on a Tuesday, followed by dinner. And there was, in my view, a noticeable and distinctive quality of life in the hall, which marked it out from many other colleges. And it was a quality which was to do with this stability, this sense of being in community. And I valued that, and it was an inspiration for me in my role at Canon. And then, in this week's tablet, I read with fascination an interview with Professor Susan Greenfield, Professor of Pharmacology in this university and a Fellow of Lincoln, who holds no religious creed, but who's just completed a retreat at Ampleforth. She was struck, she says, by how quickly the time had passed, despite barely looking at her mobile and being without computers or TV. I felt so supercharged and super detoxed, really bursting with energy and positive, she said. A few days' absence and in real community, in the rhythm, had made a difference. It's the most extraordinary interview. Do get the tablet. No, I mustn't advertise, must I? But so the suggestion that perhaps God was looking for her by the interviewer, she replied with a laugh, I know, but he's playing hide and seek at the moment. And so he is with many millions of us the world over. But I believe the place where he may be found, or where we may be found by him, is when we are rooted and grounded in love with the saints. That is, in community, with others, in a regular pattern of life. This will take various forms, but it is the Benedictine legacy. Challenge, questions? Yes.
I wonder if the same criticism that the printed book were not made when printed books first came out, they would destroy the sense of community in the church because of the ubiquitous nature of communication, as you're making against Facebook and Twitter and so forth.
Sorry, could you say the first bit of that again?
Yes, when printed books first came out, they were seen as a great challenge to, well, certainly to the authority of the church, but also to communication. I wonder if as with books, that eventually Twitter and Facebook will become part of the church's way of reaching out and creating community.
Yes, I wonder if they will. But it will need care, won't it, you see? I think this is the point I'm making, such transitions in culture need care. And so one goes back to the roots and say, now, what is the essence here? Which is why I've been concentrating on essence. There's a community of Benedictine nuns in London, you see, who, where I've seen on television a nun doing Facebook, and this is her daily role, you see. I think they're enclosed and so on, but she's out there with the message, and that's fine. That's fine. But you know, my grandchildren. I have a little grandchild of 5, you see, who comes walking in with his mobile, and when we sit down to engage, or I read him a story, the mobile might go, you see. So I'm now putting a basket in the hall, and mobiles go into the basket so that they can relate, you know. It's so important. And I've noticed this with students. The mobiles are there all the time, so that conversations with real people are interrupted. Now that seems to me to be a misuse. That's why I told my, I hope, funny story. You know. So yes, I think you're right. In these great transitions, I once had to preach to the stationers and that guild in the city, and of course they were given a sort of authority over the printed word, which lasted until well into the 17th, probably the beginning of the 18th century. They had to have the imprimatur of the stationers before things were released. Well, perhaps that's going to happen. I guess we've got to listen to the news to see if they're reintroducing that when Levison makes his report. You know, these changes happen.
It's just that one of the things, as you were speaking, one of the things I did when you quoted Ephesians, I got my mobile app out and I looked up that text and put it in context.
Yes.
So, and one is able to do that. Well, there's actually a paper Bible here. But that's one way in which it can be used very positively.
Absolutely. And I'm not denying it. It wasn't an oldies rant. It wasn't.
Thank you.
You talked about the Benedictine spirituality, about rooted and grounded in love.
Yes.
In love, but not in bricks and mortars.
No.
Because how do you get this together? The stabilitas loci of the Benedictines, together with the scene in the Transfiguration, where Peter wanted to have some real estate development, building 3 huts, preserving a nice situation and building a church or whatever, a house. So, didn't Jesus say no stabilitas loci?
I think, thank you, that's a clever question, but an important one. I think that it's for the face-to-face life lived together. That doesn't need, it could be done in a tent as well as a beautiful building. That's what I'm saying, yes.
Or in cyberspace.
Or maybe. But I think we need to learn how to do it, which was really the point I've been making. I think there's some learning to go on here. I remember last year, the year before, dear Archbishop Tutu, an Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town, peace Nobel Peace winner, came to Oxford, and I'd known him for many years. Indeed, I was taught to ride in what was then Basutoland, Lesotho now, by the same man who taught him to ride a horse. So we go back a long way to the 60s. But he was talking, when he was over here, of that African thing, he called it Ubuntu. Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is, I am because you are. We actually are all connected, and I am not fully myself if I'm not in relationship with you and know and value that relationship. Yeah. It's a wonderful thing. So, someone comes to the door and is hungry, and Ubuntu compels you to bring them in, and you sit with the family. It's a community thing. Now, in answer to your question, this of course can be done in many ways, in many cultures. I think the point I'm making is, I think that as the culture changes, so we take great care as we work out how that is worked out in depth. You see, the thing about Benedict was how he worked out in depth the relationships, the faults, the way faults should be dealt with, the structures of society, all to do with relationships. The chapter, the way it decides things. Dash it all, we've seen in the last few days, last few weeks, with the Twitter thing about Lord. Yes, mustn't mention the name, but who was wrongly accused. The way it just spread, you see. Now that's the antithesis of what could happen in a regulated community, you see, and yet it can happen. So it's my caution. Of course, I ought to have a better computer. Of course, my mobile phone, which I have, ought to be turned on. In fact, I don't turn it on. I only use it in an emergency and say, help, come and get me. But that's because I'm old. Other people will learn how to use them within this context, I'm sure. Yes?
Historical view of how the legacy has been translated from Catholic to Anglican and to the e-generation. I was Baptist, and I think it missed that Reformation. Do you have any thoughts about how the non-conformists begin again to grasp the
Well, I do know how many non-conformist friends of mine, in fact, have been to both Anglican and Catholic monasteries and welcome hospitality, an opportunity for retreat, and just being there and being part of this throbbing community around the heartbeat of the hours, and turning off their mobiles, learning not to speak for a bit and to listen. Many friends of mine from non-conformist religion have done this and have come renewed as a result, rather as a professor felt. This was a new and different experience and helped them to know themselves better, to know what to look for in relationships, to deepen relationships, and not to deepen relationships. So yes, the opportunity is there, and I'm sure that's true at Alton and all over. And it there's a funny sort of knock-on effect of this, as I found at St. Benedict's. These are ordinary undergraduate students, you know. But there was a quality about the gathering before the meal and chatting afterwards, and their sort of sense of a guest and a welcome to that guest, which is what I wanted to take with me to our nice, lovely secular college in creating that. It's got more difficult now because I think we're the largest graduate college in the university with over 700 students. But then we were just a few hundred. Say more? Say less?
Lots to think about, digest.
I hope so. I hope so.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I forgot to mention in my introduction that Vincent is very largely responsible for nurturing my faith at a time of crisis and for my formation when I was training to be a priest. So I have a huge gratitude for all that he has done for me and all that he has done for you as well, because this has been, in my opinion, a wonderful way in which to end this series. I want to thank you all, especially those who've come faithfully week after week, and I hope that you have been enriched by this experience. We have more to offer you of different sort next term, turning our focus to Ignatius. But I hope that Benedict will stay with you, because the spirituality is absolutely wonderful and we can learn so much from it. So with that I will end, but simply to say thank you again, and we have some expenses of course with a series like this, so if you're able to give a donation it would be much appreciated. And I would like you to join with me in thanking Canon Strudwick for his talk.